let's put this in the context of the church and of liturgy. Of course, we know that each year has a different gospel on the Sundays. We're just beginning, we've just entered into the year of Matthew. There's year of Matthew, year of Mark, year of Luke. And John, what happened to John? I would say more about John later because we've got lots coming up about John's gospel in our program for the year of the God who speaks. But the gospels that sort of span the whole year, the Sundays of the year, not all the Sundays, but most of them, are the three gospels we call synoptics, that look at the story of Jesus in the similar way. Not in the same way, but in a similar way. Mark, Matthew, and Luke. To consider Matthew's gospel, we need to think also about Mark, because it is absolutely the opinion of the vast majority of believers and of scholars that Mark is the first gospel to be written, because a comparative study of those three gospels demonstrates that. And so if we're thinking, forget about Luke for tonight, think about Mark and Matthew, we're going to be interested in what Matthew's gospel does to the gospel of Mark. And you know the Sea of Galilee, you know Capernaum, you know those places up there, Nazareth, etc. So Mark has the first 8 chapters, more or less, beginning from the north. And then he has Jesus travel from chapter 8 onwards down to Jerusalem in the south, where Jesus teaches. Jesus finally is arrested and crucified and rises from the dead. So that's the basic structure in Mark. And that structure can be discovered in Matthew. It's also in Matthew. However, Matthew has done so much else with the gospel tradition to create his gospel that you might not notice it. Okay, so the first thing, you might say to me, which Bible should I use? And I'm obviously going to say the Revised New Jerusalem Bible. We still have plenty of copies. You people never been before? Very cheap, £30 instead of 40. Right? We can get more. Right? So I'm going to use this Bible, this translation, which is the latest version, if you like, of the Bible that we use in church for the last 50 years, the Jerusalem Bible. So there was a New Jerusalem Bible, and now there's a revised New Jerusalem Bible. And I'll put in a plug for Henry Wansborough. Dom Henry Wansborough, who oversaw this translation, is speaking next Wednesday evening at the Jesuit Centre in London. You can get a ticket and I'll see you there. Okay. So if we ask ourselves, what does Matthew do to the gospel structure of Mark? He begins with the 2 chapters, 1 and 2, which we call infancy narratives. Now, they're the chapters that include the traditions that we read at Christmas, along with, of course, the other gospel that considers the birth of Jesus, events leading up to the birth and following the birth, which is Luke. So only Matthew and Luke focus on the birth of Jesus and on the events before and after the birth of Jesus. So let's just see what Matthew does. Matthew opens his gospel with the words, well, Henry's translated, the roll of the genealogy of Jesus. The words in Greek are biblos genesios, which is the book of, if you like, the Genesis of Jesus Christ. The Genesis of Jesus Christ. So the New Testament begins, as the Old Testament began, with Genesis. with a Genesis, but this is the coming to be of Jesus Christ. And you probably are aware, certainly Deacon Matthew would be aware, that then comes a really scary bit of the gospel, because in chapter 1, verses 2 all the way through to verse 17, we have the genealogy of Jesus, which is how many generations? 42 generations of names. This is the gospel when the parish priest will say to the deacon, you must be there on this particular day because you must read the gospel, because I'm not embarrassing myself by reading it. So we go all the way through. So what has Matthew done? He traces the ancestors from Abraham down to Jesus. He's created this genealogy, as we call it. Some of it will be historical, some of it will be imaginary, some of it will be, what are we looking for here? We're not looking for historical record, even though we've got historical names. We're looking to what is Matthew actually saying in these opening verses. And when you look at the structure of the genealogy, it's actually 14 plus 14 plus 14 generations. So it goes from Abraham to King David, from King David to the exile, and from the exile to Jesus Christ. And we have 5 scenes, 5 bits of story in the rest of chapter 1 and in chapter 2. Each of those scenes ends with something which is characteristic of Matthew. What is Matthew's, and by Matthew I mean the evangelist. I don't mean necessarily St. Matthew the Apostle. We can come back to that later on. So whoever composed this gospel has an agenda. Each gospel writer has several agendas, several sort of things they want to make clear for Christians. I don't mean agenda in any negative way. I mean a very positive way. What do I want to explain to the people that are going to read or hear my gospel? And that genealogy suggests that one of the things that preoccupies Matthew is the Jewish history leading up to Jesus Christ. Okay. The way that the history, what we call the history of salvation, through from Abraham up to the time of Jesus, is so important. And this is important also for Christians. But if Matthew is interested above all in those Jews who want to become Christians, it's even more important that he shows that continuity, that he shows that if you're a good Jew, you'll become a Christian, because it's a fulfillment of what our fathers and mothers believed. Okay? And so when we get into these 5 stories after the genealogy, so it goes from chapter 1, verse 18 to chapter 2, the end of chapter 2, verse 23, each of the stories, each of these 5 segments ends with the words, all this happened to fulfill what the prophet said, and then gives a quotation from the Old Testament. Okay? We know that. We're used to that. So, for example, the first part of the story is actually what we could well call, though we're not used to calling it this, the Annunciation to Joseph. Okay? Mary has an Annunciation. She's wide awake. She's generally depicted to be at her prie-dieu, at prayer, reading the scriptures or doing the housework, and she has a visitation. But Joseph's in bed. Joseph is asleep when the angel of the Lord comes to him and says, Joseph, I know you're dreadfully worried about what's happened to Mary. And he says, yes. And this invitation, what has been conceived in her is of God. And therefore, you are invited to take Mary and her child home with you, to go through on the marriage. They're already betrothed. You know the story. And then we have the quotation from the prophet Isaiah, the virgin is with child, will give birth to a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel. Right, this is chapter 7 of Isaiah. What, if you're already being surprised by the gospel, you might be surprised by how much work there might be to do to appreciate what's there. And one of the things is each of these quotations from the Old Testament, you would have to go back to the Old Testament and explore it in its context, what it means, etc. Okay? As it is, we go to church and we hear it, and it's like water off a duck's back, or whatever you want to say. Isn't it lovely? So we do like hearing the gospel, but there's so much more to it than perhaps we know. Okay. So if we go through the first two chapters, you've got the Magi, you've got the wise men, not in Luke, not anywhere else, only in Matthew. And we have the fulfillment quotations from the Old Testament. I notice it's already 7:20. I won't actually go through all of this in detail. But the technique of Matthew in these two chapters and throughout the gospel is going to be to demonstrate to you, particularly to Jews who are attracted to Christianity, who say, yes, I do think Jesus is the fulfillment of our ancient faith, to demonstrate with texts of the Old Testament this all happened to fulfill what we already know and what we have been led to look forward to by reading our scriptures. Okay, so you've got, for example, our beautiful one comes in chapter 2, verse 15. I called my son out of Egypt. Those are words of the prophet Hosea. Yeah? Remember, the people were lost in Egypt and God called them out, what we call the Exodus. And the same happened to Jesus. They went as refugees to Egypt, and then they came out of Egypt. And he says, this fulfills the prophecy, I called my son out of Egypt. You see how it takes on a new meaning. Now, throughout all of this, as I said, the hero is Joseph. And Joseph is a dreamer. I don't mean it in that sense. Joseph has dreams. Communications come to him in dreams. And you think, because you know Genesis, you think, I know another dreamer. This is in the end of the book of Genesis. Joseph, son of Jacob, was famous as a dreamer and an interpreter of the dreams of the Pharaoh. That's how he got to get the position that he ended up in, position of power in Egypt. But Joseph has dreams. It's through dreams that Joseph is invited to collaborate with this journey of Jesus and Mary. Yeah. So there are several. If you read chapters 1 to 2 carefully, you'll find several dreams. The dream to take the child and his wife, the dream to go into Egypt, the dream to come back from Egypt, and they come back and they say, well, we'll go to Bethlehem, that's what we're used to. And no, another dream, and they go up to Nazareth. So the whole of those two chapters is molded into this story of how Jesus is the protector of Mary and the child. And of course, what happens for us in our celebration of Christmas and with our cribs is it all gets confused, which is all right. We're allowed to be confused, but you've got the shepherds and you've got the kings and you've got, right? So to have a sort of clarity of vision, and how the different stories fit with the agendas or with the purposes of the different evangelists. So Luke will be stressing the parallel between the annunciation of the coming of John the Baptist and the birth of John the Baptist, and then the same for Jesus, right? So John the Baptist is not in the infancy story of Matthew. Matthew is primarily Joseph and then Herod the enemy, and the Magi, the good kings, I'm going to call them kings, who of course are Gentiles. So the issue of Jewish welcoming of their Messiah, of our Messiah, is accompanied with this question. Well, the Gentiles are coming as well, even at this early stage. So the big issue for the early church, or one of the big issues for the early church, is this Messiah, is Jesus come for Jews or for Gentiles? And that's an issue throughout the Gospel of Matthew, and one which has already been raised implicitly here. The Magi are in fact Gentile. Okay, how are we doing so far? It's about 7:25, and we've had a look at 2 chapters, so we only have 26 to go. But now what's going to happen is those 2 chapters have no parallel in Mark. All right? There's nothing about those events, the circumstances of the birth of Jesus in Mark. You might say, well, there is a kind of parallel in Luke, but it's very different, though there are some things which the 2, Matthew and Luke, have in common. When we get into chapter 3, we're into material which is also found in Mark, because chapter 3 begins with the presentation of John the Baptist. Okay? If you go to Mark, he's there, page 1. First verses, John the Baptist. How does Mark begin? The Gospel of Jesus Christ. Remind me how the Gospel of Mark begins. Anyway, it talks about a voice in the wilderness, and it's on to John the Baptist within 2 or 3 verses. Okay? Whereas in Matthew, we have to wait until chapter 3, and then we start comparing Matthew with Mark, because we find a lot of this is very similar, but Matthew has enhanced Mark, changed Mark, added to Mark, omitted things from Mark, but it's obvious that that's the way round, right? It wasn't Matthew then Mark, as we thought for centuries, because St. Augustine thought it was Matthew, but St. Augustine thought that was the right way round. No, it's very obviously Mark to Matthew. So, okay. Chapter 3, the presentation of John the Baptist, and then obviously the baptism of Jesus. But the presentation of John the Baptist, which is so brief in Mark, because Mark just wants to get on with it. No? It's kind of pocket version of the gospel. Matthew enhances that and gives us words of preaching of John the Baptist, particularly when he sees Pharisees and Sadducees, all these great religious people coming for baptism. He says, brood of vipers. Well, and we have this wonderful speech about produce fruit worthy of repentance. You say we have Abraham for our father, but God can raise up children for Abraham from these stones. This is the tradition of John the Baptist. He's quite feisty. Of course, John the Baptist then has a shock that Jesus is so understanding and welcoming of people. That's another story. Okay. You remember last Sunday we celebrated the Feast of the Baptism, and we read the account of the baptism from the Gospel of Matthew. And there was a difference, wasn't there? There was something in there which you wouldn't find in Mark, and you wouldn't find in Luke. You certainly wouldn't find in John. And that is the words of John the Baptist. When Jesus comes to him to be baptized, John says, this is chapter 3, verse 14, I need to be baptized by you, and you come to me. So this sense that John knows who this is, knows what this man represents and has come for. He said, no, I can't baptize you. And what does Jesus say? Leave it for the time being. Leave it for the time. This is Henry Wandsworth's translation. Leave it for the time being, for so it is fitting that we should fulfill all righteousness. And you say, what? Fulfill all righteousness. Now, in other words, Jesus is saying, I want this to happen. I want to have your baptism. Okay? And that small couple of verses, that dialogue, is actually answering a question that Christians would have asked. Well, surely John should not have baptized Jesus. Well, actually, he didn't want to. No? But Jesus insisted that he be baptized by John. Okay, so you can see how the story is already bringing out answers to the kind of questions that people learning about their faith were coming up with. Well, why would Jesus wish to be baptized? Because he stood with sinners and he was ready for the baptism of John. He wished to have the baptism of John. Okay, and then you have the voice and you have the vision, very similar to Mark's gospel. But one thing there which I will point out, there'll be a few things that keep coming back if I remember to bring them back. One is this statement, fulfill all righteousness. The word fulfill is very important in Matthew. We've already seen it, that this all happened to fulfill the prophecy. But the other word which is crucial in Matthew is the word translated here, righteousness, which I'd much rather translate justice. Justice, right. Righteousness is the tradition, the English translation tradition, so they put righteousness. But I think fulfill all justice. Righteousness would kind of, well, what does that mean? And it's such a scary word, where justice. And just we've already had, because Joseph, when he was wrestling with his dilemma about Mary, this is back in chapter 1, verse 19, being a righteous man, again, being a just man, he wanted to get this right. He wanted to do it right. Okay, so we've already had justice twice, or righteousness twice. Okay, so we've got into the beginning of the public appearance of Jesus with the baptism by John. Okay? Okay, we're doing fine. The next chapter, chapter 4, we're still in chapter 1 in Mark. Right? If you want to get the two Gospels, there's a volume called Gospel Parallels, which will put them alongside for you. If you Google Gospel Parallels, you can get it from the internet. But when we're getting into chapter 4, we have the temptations of Jesus, the testing in the desert. And this is actually building on verses 12 and 13 of Mark. So we've only got, Mark is so brief in all these things, but Matthew, for some of these traditions, wants to fill them out. So both Matthew, and happens to Luke as well, they want to tell us what the temptations were and what the dialogue between Jesus and Satan was. So you know the story, don't you? So wait for the first Sunday of Lent and you'll hear it again, the story of the temptations of Jesus in Matthew 2020. But when you get to 2021, you'll have Mark, and it's a case of, goes like that. He was with the wild beast, he went into the wilderness, he was tempted by Satan, he was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. And that is Mark's account of the presence of Jesus in the desert, the 40-day presence in the desert. Whereas Matthew and Luke, not John. John's not going to talk about the temptation of Jesus. But that's another story. But Matthew has filled out that basic statement of Mark in ways that are very fruitful and that we can reflect on using scripture. You know, the temptation to abuse power, the temptation to want control, fall down and worship me, and I will give you everything. All these kind of things. So this is, where does this come from? Is this from Jesus? See, that's what we have to ask God. Is this from? Did Jesus tell somebody what his temptations were? Or are we dealing with what the early Christians thought? Well, how could Jesus be tempted? And what would have been his temptations? No? So these are the kind of questions that a comparison of the gospel raises. Okay, let's get going. After the temptation, then, we're going to have the missionary activity of Jesus. We're going to have preaching. We're going to have healings. Okay? So, but Matthew has a very solemn way of introducing it. This is chapter 4, verse 12. Hearing that John had been arrested, so John, who was preparing the way, is now not around anymore, Jesus withdrew to Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he went and settled in Capernaum. Matthew's very clear that Capernaum was the center of Jesus' mission in the north. Beside the lake, so if you've been to Holy Land, you'll remember Capernaum, wonderful excavations. But then, once again, Matthew explains it's on the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali, two of the 12 sons of Jacob, with their territory around that area. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. So he's bringing in a prophecy to illustrate the significance of what's going on. And it's from chapter 8 of Isaiah, land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. And then those wonderful words, the people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. Okay, so it's, what's going on here is, this is the start of it really. I suppose we've had the star, but this symbol of light, which really comes in all the Gospels, but Matthew is now proclaiming that the coming of Jesus, the coming of his gospel, is a light. On those who live in a country and shadow of death, a light has dawned. Okay, so we're getting started on the ministry of Jesus. Okay. Are you wilting? No. Good. Okay, you're not wilting. Right. So chapter 4, we're going into the ministry of Jesus. Remember what I said about Mark. Mark has two parts. The first part is the preaching of Jesus in the north, in Galilee. The second part begins with the journey to Jerusalem. So the second part of Mark's Gospel, 8 to 16, is all about the journey to the cross. Okay? Journey to Jerusalem and what happens in Jerusalem. Two parts. All right? Okay. Now what is Matthew doing to those two parts? You could think, oh, he's forgotten about that because he's got so much else to tell us. He's going to give us 5 great speeches of Jesus, and they are the things that really hold the gospel together. You might be right, but Matthew has not forgotten this basic movement in the Gospel of Mark. The ministry in the north, the journey to the place of death and resurrection. So Matthew, verse 17 of chapter 4, from this time onwards, Jesus began his proclamation with the message, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is close at hand. Okay, so 4:17, repent, the kingdom of heaven is close at hand. But he says, from now onwards, this is what Jesus is doing. We've started, and this is the focus. Go back to Mark, and you have the same statement, repent and believe the good news, the kingdom of God is near at hand. Matthew is maintaining, as I say, this twofold structure of Mark, because in chapter 16 probably, he's going to introduce the time of the Passion, the time of the journey to Jerusalem. He's going to say from this time onwards, Jesus began to show his disciples that he was going to go to Jerusalem to suffer death. Okay? If I give you the verse, you can check that out. 16:21. So from 4:17 and 16:21, we have those two parts of the gospel which reflect the structure of Mark. But of course, there's loads more material in Matthew. He's respected that kind of line of the plot of the gospel, but he's bringing in a lot of new things as well. What would you expect to happen next? Well, obvious. Calling of the disciples. Okay, so we have calling of disciples. We can't go into all of this in detail. We are on schedule to finish for 8 o'clock, by the way, so please don't, I think. Now, I've talked about structure, the structure of Mark. I've talked about how that structure is brought as a basic element of Matthew's gospel. I've talked about the addition of 2 chapters at the beginning, okay? But there is another major element that Matthew brings, and that is the 5 speeches of Jesus. 5 great speeches of Jesus. And the first one, you won't be surprised to hear, is the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? Now, what does this mean? If we try and reflect about how did we get this gospel? How is it composed? How is it put together? What does it represent? So if I say, well, this evangelist wants to give you 5 speeches, and you say, oh, I know what that's about, don't you? Say it's about Moses. It's about the Pentateuch. Well, Moses, 5 books. So Matthew is saying, here's another Moses, a new Moses, a better Moses. Huh? And he's going to have 5 speeches. Okay? And if you think back to chapters 1 and 2, what happened to Jesus in his youth? You know, just as the Pharaoh tried to kill all the Hebrew male children, Herod was doing the same. And just as Moses escaped, so did Jesus escape. So there are all these things that make you think, so what's that story really about? Okay? And also makes you think, well, did it happen then? We can't go into that. Well, we could perhaps later on. So there's a Moses, there's a new Moses being presented, and he does it above all through these 5 speeches. Okay, so you look at chapter 5, this is where the Sermon on the Mount begins. Right? And you couldn't get more solemn than this. You couldn't say, Jesus said, no. Seeing the crowds, he went onto the mountain, and when he was seated, you know, if you're really giving a discourse, you sit. I'm just thinking of the Queen in Parliament. I can't think of... Or the bishop. I mean, the bishop in the cathedral should be sitting on his throne when he's preaching, but they tend to be humble people, so they stand. I wouldn't mind sitting. Do you want me to sit here? Sometimes I much prefer sitting. Anyway, when he was seated, his disciples came, and then he began to speak, and this is what he taught them. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So you have this huge introduction, which is 2 verses long. So we know that what's coming is something quite significant. Okay? Now, if you go to the end of chapter 7, so 5, 6, and 7, the end of chapter 7, we've had a solemn introduction. Now we've got a solemn conclusion. All right? Okay. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one having authority, not like their scribes. Okay? Now, obviously, we can't go into a whole lot of detail about these different speeches, but what kind of signals more than anything else that these speeches are important is the solemn beginning and the solemn ending on each occasion. So I just want to take you to chapter 13. Now, chapter 13 is the central speech, speech number 3 of 5, and it's known as the parable discourse. It's all the parables. So, so what's Matthew done? We put all the parables together. Jesus, the same day, he left the house, he sat by the lakeside, but such large crowds gathered round him that he got into the boat and sat there. So he was going to sit. The people all stood on the shore, and he told them many things in parables. And he said, that's the introduction to the parable speech, the parable discourse. And at the end of chapter 13, well, towards the end, we have, when Jesus had finished these parables, he left there. So at the end of each of the 5 speeches, it says, when Jesus had finished. Now, sometimes the translator is far too free. Right? But if you go to the Greek, it says, and it happened when Jesus finished. Those words are always the same. Okay? And at the end of the last discourse, this is into the beginning of chapter 26. Beginning of chapter 26, I think. Yes, it would be. Beginning of chapter 26, when he's finished the last discourse, it says, Jesus had now finished all he wanted to say. In other words, his whole lifetime of teaching. Okay? So, if we can just get a hold of this, we have the same basic story. Well, we've got 2 chapters at the beginning, which are something different. But then we've got the story of Galilee and the story of Jerusalem, as in Mark. But superimposed on that, and with a whole lot of new material, we have 5 speeches. And each speech ends with that solemn conclusion. Now, if you want the references to the end of each speech, what I'd tell you is the end of chapter 7, the end of chapter 10, towards the end of chapter 13, chapter 18, and the end of chapter 25, which is actually the beginning of chapter 26. Right? So if you search them out, and find something which says when Jesus had finished, or Jesus had now finished, and that marks the ending of 5 speeches. But in fact, the beginning of those speeches is also very solemn, particularly as we saw the Sermon on the Mount, the parable sermon, the final one, which is chapters 24, 25, which is about the end of time and the final judgment. Let me just read you that so that you can see how solemn that is. Jesus left the temple, and as he was going away with his disciples, came up to him to draw his attention to the temple. And they said, "Look at these stones." And he said, "Oh, not one stone will be left on another." And while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came and asked him, "Tell us when this will be and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the world." So once again, he's sitting and you have a long speech, which is chapters 24, 25. Now, I'm sure there's some teachers among you. you would never sit down and teach in one lesson the Sermon on the Mount, would you? Chapter 5, 6, and 7. You wouldn't even teach all the parables in chapter 13 because people can't take it in. Do you see what I mean? So Matthew has gathered these things together so that Christians can hear them, read them. Yeah? I don't think, well, at least my question is, I don't have to have an opinion on this, but I can ask the question, would Jesus really have sat there and went through all this wonderful material in the Sermon on the Mount in one go? No, I don't think so. Because they would have forgotten the Beatitudes by the time he got to the Our Father. You know? So, but these are, like, this is again something that, what a sort of basic approach to the gospel would be, I've got a finished gospel. Where did all this start? And I think, Jesus. Okay? We all agree on that. It all starts with Jesus. It comes together at the end of the gospel. But how does all this material, how is it all put together? It's remembered, it's preached, it's added to, it's explained. Oh, we got a bit from Mark, but we're going to add a bit more. Because do you know what so-and-so said? Remember the day that this happened or that happened? So the point is that we have to try and be realistic about how the gospel, material in the gospel was brought together. But we can't have sort of definite answers. The only definite answer is that, well, this sounds pretty convincing, and the church has believed it from the start. Of course, what has the church believed about it is another question, and that's going on and on. Okay, so the issue of what do we find in the gospel? We do not find word for word, actions exactly as they happened. Because one of the great graces of the beauty of the gospel is that they are different. They're inviting us to open our mind to different approaches to Jesus. And they didn't really stop with the New Testament. So you've still got people with their ideas about Jesus, and they're not as reliable as the Gospels, maybe not as beautiful as the Gospels, but maybe we need to open our minds to some of the ways in which Jesus has been understood on the basis of the New Testament. Okay. Right, so how far have we got? I think we've got quite a long way. I have kind of cheated. Well, we've got into the Sermon on the Mount, but not in any particular detail. So perhaps in the last 5 minutes, I will just point to some things in the Sermon on the Mount. We have the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, etc. These ways of speaking, which are found all through the Old Testament. You've got happy is the man who this and happy is the man who that, blessed is, okay. But have a richness in talking about the qualities of people's lives and how they cope with difficult situations, and that these are channels of God's blessing. We have the statement about Jesus coming not to abolish but to fulfill. That's chapter 5, verse 17. That's a very important statement. The times that Jesus says, I have come for this, are very few in the Gospels, but obviously they're very significant. You say, what are you really about, Jesus? I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. That's a very important statement for Jews who are thinking about the claims of Christians about Jesus Christ. Okay, and then just the last reference in the Sermon on the Mount, 5:20. If your righteousness / justice is no greater than that in the scribes of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So that word justice, which I'm insisting on translating justice, what does it mean? Your justice. What is your justice like? And that is absolutely on the agenda of Pope Francis. What do we mean by justice? And where does mercy come into it? And we can explore the Old Testament and discover that the justice of God also has room for mercy. So is Jesus saying, or is this too simplistic? Is Jesus saying, your justice must be greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees? The Jerusalem Bible, first one, said, your virtue. But don't translate the same word in different ways, because then people who don't know Greek don't realize it's the same word. On the other hand, sometimes a word in Greek needs different translations. So you see the problem of translation. Okay. And then we have the Our Father as also part of the Sermon on the Mount, and instructions about fasting and almsgiving and prayer that we're going to have once more offered to us in a few weeks' time as we begin Lent. Right, so that's the first speech, chapters 5, 6 and 7. Then there's a space, and in that space Matthew has assembled stories of what we call miracles, mighty deeds of Jesus. 10 mighty deeds of Jesus in chapter 8, and then into chapter 9. 8 and 9. So wouldn't it be wonderful before next week if you just try to read the Sermon on the Mount, not in one sitting, but as a kind of thing that you do. And then 8 and 9 are the miracles of Jesus, a collection of miracles. So once again, Matthew has put them all together in a group. Not an obvious group, but they have been collected, because in Mark's tradition they're not necessarily in that order and they're not all together. Okay. We have, I will maintain 2 weeks' time, that we have reached chapter 16. You may disagree with me. We've reached chapter 16 because it's in chapter 16 that we have the second part beginning. Remember, from this time onwards, Jesus began to show the disciples he must go to Jerusalem and suffer. This is chapter 16, verse 21. Okay? So that next time we can look at the rest of the ministry, and above all, we can look at the passion story, the passion, the Matthew passion, and see what that offers